We're almost at the end of our coverage of Sublime Text events and event listeners. We've covered the two different ways you can create an event listener and almost all of the events that you can listen for. There's only one event left to talk about. We're going to cover that today in this very lesson. And this is a very powerful event because it allows you to elevate Sublime Text from simple text editor to powerful code editing tool by allowing you to manipulate what appears in the auto completion panel when it appears based on the contents of your document. So you could really turn Sublime Text into exactly the tool you need to get your work done quickly. And we're covering it right now. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odan Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video course teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. Now, here in Plugin 101, the last few videos have focused on events and event listeners, what they are, how to create them, and what events we can listen for. This is going to be the last of the tutorial type videos where we talk about the actual events. Then we can move into actually some more use cases of the stuff that we have learned about events and event listeners to get a better handle on it and other exciting topics. Now, the topic of this week's lesson is the on-query completions event. Now, this is an event that Sublime will raise whenever it's about to open the auto completion panel, allowing us to contribute our own completions to appear inside of the panel or even take away some of the items that already exist inside of the panel to really dial it in. And this is, as you might imagine, a very powerful concept because it allows you to modify what is appearing inside the auto completion buffer. So you could make Sublime into a high-level IDE by taking this opportunity to do code analysis and analysis of the areas around the cursor to know exactly what completions are most targeted and beneficial for the particular location. Or if you don't want something like that, you could also do some simpler code as well. You don't have to analyze files. You could use this to just inject simple completions. Now, an example of the more complex end of this operation would be the LSP plugin, which uses the same plugin server technology as Visual Studio Code uses to provide language intelligence and a lot of other features, not just auto completion. So you could create something along those lines if you wanted to for your own or add support for your own custom languages if you're creating a package that's doing something like that. Or you could do a lot simpler things, just injecting completions. And an example of something like that can be found in the Simple Notes plugin video series here on the channel, which I've linked down in the description below. This is one of the first things that appeared on the channel back a couple of years ago now, probably. That's 5 videos recorded live. So about 5 hours-ish of content in that thing. And we start from first principles with a question asked by someone on Stack Overflow, how to achieve a particular thing working with a certain type of notes file. And we walk through in that 5-hour period, creating a syntax for it, creating custom commands, creating event listeners, including custom completions just like this, adding settings, even wrapping it up and turning it into a package that could be distributed to other people. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, that might be interesting to watch. You can find that linked down below. Now, before we get into this, we should also point out that the on-query completions event is one of the events that has been severely upgraded, if you will, in the versions of Sublime Text that aren't publicly available yet, but are being tested by dedicated users in the Discord. So what we're covering here will work in the new version of Sublime when it eventually becomes publicly available, or right now if you have access to those builds. But when that build does become available, we're going to cycle back to this one and cover all of the exciting new possibilities because this thing is even more powerful in those builds than it appears to be right in this one. So if you haven't already done so, you're going to want to use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share, ring the bell notification icon because that's going to be a lesson you're not going to want to miss. Now we have here an example event listener showing some of the things we can do with this particular event. And as in the previous examples, this is an event listener, but this will also work in a view event listener as well. As you might expect, the only difference is the actual event itself won't get the view argument passed to it when it's raised in a view event listener because view event listeners are created one instance per view to which they apply and they have access to that view via their self.view property, so it doesn't need to be provided. Apart from that, everything we're saying here will apply regardless of which way you do this particular thing. And in upcoming lessons on the channel in the next couple of lessons, we're going to be going through some more concrete examples to show view event listeners versus event listeners and some concrete examples. So stay tuned for those in upcoming lessons if what we were saying in the last couple of lessons doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense. Now, this on-query completions event will be raised once for every view to which it applies. And in the case of an event listener is every view everywhere, because there's one instance of this it triggers for every view. And a view event listener, well, it would only trigger if that view event listener actually applied to that particular view. Now we respond to this event by telling Sublime what autocompletions it should add to the autocompletion panel for us in that particular view. And that can be none, or it can be any number of completions that we might like. In order to help us gather that information, Sublime provides us with 3 arguments, or 2 if this is a view event lister. The first one is the view that the panel is actually being displayed in. That's important. You're going to need to examine perhaps the content of the file to know what needs to be injected as an autocompletion item. You need to know what view it's actually in. And a view event listener, that's not provided because it's in the property self.view, but otherwise the same thing applies. And the next 2 items here are prefix and locations. Prefix is going to be the text to the left of the caret or carets, or cursor or cursors or insertion points, whatever you'd like to do there. And the locations is a list of points. And remember from the lesson where we talked about terminology of Sublime Text plugins, a point is a character offset in the buffer, which represents where the cursors are, or the carets are, the insertion points are, whichever terminology you prefer for that. Now, locations is a list because there can be any number of cursors in the file, but the prefix, that's always a single string, because Sublime's autocompletion won't allow it to pop up if there's multiple cursors and the text to the left of them, the word to the left of them, isn't the same for all of them, because it would be ambiguous. If you had 2 cursors and one was next to the name Bob and the next one was next to the name Jim, what autocompletions would you provide there? Autocomplete generally means that it's going to replace the prefix with something else, so that text always has to be the same. So prefix is always a single string. Now, we're not using it here in this particular example, but you could use that to narrow in on what completions you actually want to return back in the list. If you have, say, a lot of completions that you're adding, you can narrow it down. Now, Sublime does have its own internal filtering for what completions it shows based on what the prefix text is. So in a pinch, if you have just a few completions, you don't necessarily need to constrain the list. You can just return them, such as we're doing here. So that's something you could do, and you probably would do in a more complex implementation of this, but it's not something that we're doing right here. Now, because this event gets triggered for every possible view, it's important, based on what completions you're actually injecting into the buffer, that you make sure that your completions make sense for whatever the view currently is. For example, here, we're assuming we're going to be doing something Python related. So it's important that we make sure that we only add items to the auto-completion list if the current file is a Python file, because if we put Python completions into the C or C++ auto-completion list, those developers will come after us with angry pitchforks and torches because we're ruining their experience and providing them useless information inside of the auto-completion panel. There's a few different ways that we could do something like this, depending on what it is you would like to do. Now, these are all examples that refer to using scope matching. This is a very common way to make sure that the cursor is in a particular type of file or in a particular part of a certain type of file. For example, here we're testing that files are Python. You could also test something not file type related, but if you had completions that only should happen inside of comments, then you could use a comment scope. Then it would apply in all file types everywhere, or you could say only comments inside of a Python file. You can even target it down. Say if, for example, you had special tokens that you use inside of documentation comments describing your methods and you want to autocomplete those. Those only really make sense in documentation comments. You could provide a scope that says only make this available in Python file documentation comment blocks, and otherwise it won't apply. So there's a lot we can do here. We're not really covering scopes and scope selectors and how they match here. We have covered it previously on the channel in a video I've linked below on scopes and scope selectors if you need to brush up on that sort of thing. But the naive way to do this, naive I say with the finger quotes, is to assume if I'm using completions for inclusion in a Python file, then by and large, a whole file is a Python file. It doesn't necessarily matter where the cursor is inside, whether it's on line 1 or line 20, the first position or the last. The whole file is a Python file, right? So necessarily you don't need to really worry about that locations array at all. And we can just say if the first character in the file is says it's a Python file, then, or it doesn't say, rather, then we don't want to insert any completions here because this isn't Python. Because what's true of the first character in the file is true of every character in the file, right? This will work depending on what it is that you're doing, but that's not entirely true for reasons we'll see in just a moment. But just to clarify here, the locations is again a list of points, that is, all of the cursors that appear inside of the file. So if you wanted to, you could actually check the scope of the actual points inside of the file to make sure they make sense. For example, this would be a situation where you might want to test if the cursor is inside of a comment or not. And you could do that by testing the actual cursor location. You wouldn't want to test the whole file, right? You want to test if the cursor is at a particular thing. Now, here, this is just a simple example to show how you would get at the first cursor in the file. All the cursors in the file, all the selections in the file are always represented in the list in a top-down fashion. So this one's always the first one that appears in the buffer, regardless of what order they were actually created. But if you expect there to be more than one cursor, and that is entirely possible in any situation, you would probably want to test this in a more robust way. But you can do it this way if you'd like to. If you wanted to just quickly test if the cursor is inside of one and you want to assume there's only one cursor, or that the first cursor is the only one you're going to do something for, that is something we could do using locations as a list. But as a more robust example of something like this, and something we're going to keep for the rest of this, is it's possible in Sublime for one type of file to be embedded in another. For example, Python can be embedded in a Markdown file, or JavaScript and CSS can be embedded inside of an HTML file. So inside of the style tag, things are styled and it actually behaves exactly as CSS. And inside of a script tag, it behaves as JavaScript if it's the right kind of script tag. So you wouldn't want to use the naive implementation of checking if the file type is Python or JavaScript or CSS in one of those situations, because if it's embedded in another document type, then it's not going to match. If you were doing that with the JavaScript version, and if you tested 0.0, well, that would be the HTML file, so your completions would never trigger. But if there's more than one cursor, you don't want to do what we just saw and use just one item in the locations buffer either, because it's possible for one cursor to be inside of the HTML part and one part, a cursor to be inside of the JavaScript part. And even if they happen to be aligned to the same word so that the autocompletion panel will open, do you want HTML or JavaScript to intermingle? Because autocomplete injects the text into all of the cursors. You're not allowed to determine where they actually go. So what you might want to do is something like this. This is a simple list comprehension using the all function in Python to make sure that every single location in the point array matches the appropriate thing, which is what we're going to be going for here. Generally speaking, this probably something similar to this is what you want to do. Now, when it comes to actually providing the completions for this thing, that all comes down to the returned value that you return from this particular method. And what we're basically seeing here in the example so far in the non-commented out code is the two ways to do this. Although, as we can see, there's a lot of further examples. So there are other ways, but realistically, the two things that you can return from this are none, to say, I don't have any completions here, but feel free to ask somebody else. Or here's a list of completions, please add these to the list. And we can also add some flags, as we'll see in an example as we get closer to the bottom of the file. Now, the return value here is a list because you generally provide more than one autocompletion. The autocompletion buffer has, it's a list of things you can scroll through. Now, it's entirely unclear from this example, but it will become more clear in just a moment. Each one of the items in this list needs to be its own list as well. Now, one thing we can do is just provide lists of strings like this, so lists of strings. Completion items have a few bits of information in them. They have the trigger text, the text that you actually type and press tab to get them to inject, or the name that will appear on the left of the auto completion panel. We have the actual text that will be inserted, which could potentially be different from the trigger. And we also have a hint or annotation, if you will, that provides a little bit of information about what this completion is actually for, so that when you see it in the panel, you have a little bit more idea of what it's supposed to be for, because you can really only see the trigger. You can't really see the text that it's going to insert. using a simplistic method of just a single string, we're saying that the trigger text is the same as the text that will be inserted and there is no hint. So if I was to summon the auto completion panel, we can see something and other thing. And yet these are actually being provided by this. These other items here are words that are being sourced from the buffer itself. And these are examples of words that appear in here, but this is the auto completion item. And if I could hit tab, we see that injecting in. So this is indeed something that you can do, but it can be a little confusing. Now, there are a lot of cases where maybe you want something like this if you're working in your own custom language and there's a certain number of top level classes or top level API methods that you can call, and the name of them and the completion for them when they insert are the same. This is a very fast and easy way to get that sort of thing in place. But generally speaking, you may want something with a little more facility, such as this. So generally what you'd use for something like this is a list of 2 items and not 1, which gives you control over what the trigger text is versus what the inserted text is. So we can see here now the first item is the trigger text. That's the same as it was before. It's just that single string. But now the inserted text, a little bit different. It's got parentheses on the end as if something and other thing are actually methods or functions that could be called. And if I start typing, we can see there is something in there. And when I tab it, it injects with that particular text. And the same thing would also apply if I summoned the panel manually and chose, say, other thing. I can hit the key and get that injecting as well. So that's one thing we could do in that particular case, which works, but there's still one more bit of information that we can provide. So the final example that we might show for something like that is this. Now, the first item here is going to be the trigger text. We have the ability, if we so choose, as we just saw, we don't need to do this if we don't want to, but if we want to, we can include a physical tab in here by using the tab key, or character escape rather, which is syntax highlighted because this is a Python code. And the text to the right of that is a helpful annotation, if you will, that is displayed in the autocomplete panel to give you a sort of a hint of what this thing is actually supposed to be for or what it might do, because there could be multiple completions in there, some of them with similar names. Maybe you want to know, like for example, maybe you have a function and a method and a variable that all have the same trigger text. You want to be able to disambiguate which one is which. Now, so we've done that here by saying that the help text for both of these items is helper function. If I was to trigger the panel now, those completions are still there, but now we get that useful text to let us know what these things actually do. But they still do exactly the same thing as they would have done previously. We can even do it this way as well, and we see the same item there, if you will. So that is another thing that we can do there. Now, the last thing to say about this is that when it comes to that completion text itself, it's not just a plain string. It can be, but what it actually is a snippet for all intents and purposes. If you watch the lesson on the channel on snippets in Sublime Text, which I have linked below, everything you can do inside of a snippet body applies in here, which includes the numeric fields if you wanted to have more than one item, placeholders for those fields, which I haven't done here for clarity, but which is entirely possible, and even snippet variables. Presume that the text that's passed to this is the same text that you could pass to insert snippet. Sublime completion files also work the same way. So now, if I trigger this panel here, whoops, I've done that in every single take of this, by the way. I pushed the wrong key there. We get the same item here, but when I inject something, now note that the completion has $0. If we watch the snippet video, we know that that specifies the location where the cursor goes after the insertion happens. So now the cursor is inside of the brackets, ready for us to type the method arguments for this thing, if we so chose. And if we were to expand out other thing, which is, again, still a helper function here, this has the variable tm file name, which is actually a snippet variable that tells you the name of the file that you're currently inside of. So if I was to expand that out, well, we get that information too. So anything you can do in a snippet also applies here as well. Now, with all of that said, I did say at the beginning that it's possible to not only add items to the list, but also to remove them from the list as well. So what I'm going to do is comment out that one and comment this one back in. Now we can see the Return value here is now a tuple instead of a list. And the first item in the tuple is that exact list that we were just returning. The last option here that we can provide is we can return back a tuple instead of none to say no completions, or a list to say what the completions are, to give us an opportunity to provide some additional flags to what is actually happening inside of here. And this is something that's entirely optional. As you just saw, we don't actually need this. If you use the tuple, the first item would be the completions as you might otherwise provide them. So here it's the exact same example as prior, but any of those lists that we were returning would work here just as well, even the lists of single strings if we wanted to. The second item in this two tuple is flags. And there's actually two flags that we can apply here. We could use either one of these individually, or as we see in this example, we can use the bitwise OR operator if we wanted to provide both of them at the same time. And Sublime.inhibit word completions tells Sublime to not inject words from the buffer into the auto completion panel. As a matter of fact, let's uncomment this one for a second just to show that if I summon the panel, those are the two completions we're adding, but then there's also these words from the buffer that are being sourced here. And that could be variables, names of classes, things of that nature. Maybe we don't want those for what we're injecting inside of the auto completions list. Maybe we want to really target it down. So what we would actually do is something like this. So Sublime inhibit word completion stops Sublime from using those words derived from the buffer in the auto completion list. Inhibit explicit completions tells it to also not include any completions that are sourced from Sublime completion files. And that's something that we haven't covered here in Plugin 101, but we're going to be covering that in an upcoming lesson. So use the buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share. Ring the bell notification icon when we talk about completion files as a substitute for doing auto completion plugins or snippets. You'll be there to know when that actually drops. And you could stop them from appearing inside of the autocomplete panel by using this flag. Now, this isn't going to have any effect in this example because Python is a package that ships with Sublime. It doesn't have any Sublime completion files in it, but an example of a language that does ship with Sublime that does have completion files in it is Java. So you might want to try something like this using the Java functionality or Java language rather than Python to see an example of that instead. But now we've returned the exact same list as above, but we're saying we don't want any word completions. When I summon the panel, now we get only the one item in there, well, two, technically speaking, but none of the other items from the buffer actually appear inside of the list. So we can constrain those down if we would like to. One last thing to point out here, of course, as I mentioned previously, is that in upcoming builds of Sublime Text, which haven't publicly been released yet, but which are being tested by users of the Discord, this particular event has received a lot of attention. There's a lot of cool new things that we can do with this particular event. Now, everything we covered here will still work in those builds, so this isn't defunct information by any stretch of the imagination. Those builds are backwards compatible. Everything we said here still applies. What's new is extra information that we can provide back in addition to the simple hint and ways that we can return this information back. But otherwise, everything remains the same. And we're going to be covering that in an upcoming lesson as well, when those builds become publicly available. And to recap what we learned in today's lesson, we can use the onQuery completions event in an event lister or a view event lister to be told when the auto completion panel is about to become available. We get told the location of all of the cursors inside of the file, the text to the left of them if available, and the file that the auto completions are being triggered inside of, and that's going to allow us to return back exactly the list of completions we'd like to contribute, which could be a simple static list of strings. It could be information gleaned from an external source. We could even examine and do some sort of analysis on the file content to better come up with a targeted list. We even have the ability to redact certain items from the list that Sublime would automatically put there, like words from the buffer, to make sure that we get a really targeted auto completion experience. And that's going to do it for this particular lesson on this, and this actually finishes up all of the events that are possible to listen for. In the next couple of lessons, we're going to be covering some concrete examples of event listeners and view event listeners to see how we might use these in real world environments. And remember, in upcoming builds of Sublime Text that are not quite ready for public consumption, but will be soon, there's even more we can do with this event, and we will be cycling back to provide that information when those builds become publicly available. So you might want to use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share. Ring the bell notification icon so you can get the good examples and that new information when those new Sublime Text builds become publicly available. Until then, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.